And we will proceed immediately with the next paper, which will be presented by Miroslav Šedivy, who is a professor at the University of Pardubice and currently also a guest professor at the University of Klagenfurt. His research focuses on the history of Europe and the Mediterranean from the late 18th his research focuses on the history of Europe and the Mediterranean from the late 18th to the early 20th century, and he has published widely on these topics. Amongst his publications is a trilogy on the functioning of the post-Napoleonic state system in the Near East, Central Europe, and Italy, and his fourth book in English is forthcoming. The title of his talk is Metternich and the Problem of Military Interventions During the Pre-March Period. Miroslav, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I hope that you can hear me and that you can put the issue of the Congress and the Congress era within even broader context of the pre-March period. And I will focus, as already said, on the problem of military interventions, which also was linked to the problem of non-interventions and non-intervention policy. And these interventions and non-interventions into the internal affairs of independent countries was one of the most discussed European political problems between the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815 and the 1848 March revolutions. And during the 33 years of the so-called pre-March period, this issue was debated most often at times when revolutions took place or threatened to break out, namely in the early 1820s and 1830s and in the second half of the 1840s. So we can see that the first wave of huge interest in foreign interventions arose in the early 1820s, also the period of the Congress of Ljubljana. However, the Congress of Troppau is particularly remembered for its well-known protocol concluded by Austria, Prussia, and Russia on the 19th November 1820, in which these conservative powers agreed on the right of armed intervention in countries whose rulers were confronted with the open dissatisfaction of their subjects. The following Congress of Ljubljana brought little worthy of note to the intervention doctrine, especially in comparison with the Congress of Troppau, and that's why the Congress of Troppau is remembered, or the Congress of Ljubljana is remembered less in this respect than the gathering in Troppau. However, several important aspects of the Ljubljana Congress are worth noting in the research of the intervention and subsequent non-intervention debates during the pre-March period. First, the presence of Ferdinand of the Two Sicilies upon the invitation formally annexed to the Protocol of Troppau. Second, the declaration mentioning the Greek Revolution at the end of the Congress of Ljubljana. And third, the use of the term non-intervention by a British diplomat, Robert Gordon. And I would like to focus step by step on all these points and put them within the context of this intervention and non-intervention debate, and especially surely from the perspective of Metternich, who serves us as a guide in this respect. So on the 19th November 1820, at the preceding Congress in Troppau, the conservative powers had agreed in the preliminary protocol that an armed intervention in southern Italy would take place if necessary. However, with this military intervention in the territory of a sovereign country, it was crucial for Metternich that its legitimate monarch gave his consent to it. And therefore, he tried to convince Tsar Alexander I to invite Ferdinand I to Ljubljana. The king finally arrived in the Slovenian town and requested military intervention against his own kingdom. In the case of revolution in Piedmont at the same time, this demand was sent by its king directly to Vienna. Metternich continued to insist on the formal agreement of legitimate governments with interventions at the beginning of the following decade, when Austrian troops suppressed revolutions in Parma, Modena, and the Papal States in 1831. This respect for the sovereignty of a country affected by such an intervention is further proved by the contents of the treaty concluded by the three conservative powers in Berlin on the 15th October 1833. It is less known, this document, today than the Protocol of Troppau, despite the fact that it significantly complemented it. In the treaty, the three signatory powers acknowledged the right of each independent state to ask another independent state for military assistance against an internal as well as external threat. The petitioned country could accept or refuse to provide it, and no great power had the right to oppose this decision. It was also settled that any attempt to hinder the military assistance offered by one of the signatory powers would be regarded as an act of hostility against all of them. Contrary to the Troppau Protocol, the Treaty of Berlin allowed an intervention simply under the condition that it was requested by a legitimate government, which was, according to Metternich, an ideal situation entirely compatible with the existing legal norms. He advocated the conclusion of the Treaty of Berlin with the right for intervention based upon the free will of independent countries, as you can see now from the quotation. So the treaty concluded in München, Graz, and signed in Berlin on the 15th October, arrives at a settlement pure and simple of the least contestable rules of the law of nations. So that's why the presence of Ferdinand I in Ljubljana was so much important, and we must also understand this his stay in Ljubljana from the legal point of view. And for Metternich and many contemporaries, this debate on intervention and non-intervention was really legal in its character, in its scope. Now, coming to the second issue, which is which was the Greek Revolution. Despite the fact that the Greek struggle for independence wasn't included in the official agenda of the Congress of Ljubljana, the news of the uprising reached the town before the Congress ended, and it was debated unofficially and condemned. Metternich was able to convince the Tsar that it was the same revolutionary crime as those in Italy and Spain, and that the Greeks didn't deserve foreign support. On the contrary, at their 16th Congress meeting, the representatives of Austria, Prussia, and Russia elaborated and circulated a dispatch in which the monarchs of these three powers declared that they, among others, regarded as legally invalid and rejected by the principles which constitute the public law of Europe any so-called reforms made due to the insurrection and the open use of force. They acted in consequence of this declaration in the events of Naples, in those of Piedmont, and now it's coming the important part of the document, in the same events which, under very different circumstances, but by equally criminal maneuvers, have just delivered the southeastern part of Europe to incalculable turmoil. Quotation ends. So you can see that also the problem of intervention was a little bit touched in the question of the Greek Revolution. We know the story, and I don't want to spend much time on it. We know that the outcome of the three powers military intervention later in 1827, which was other powers, so France, Britain, and Russia, was the Battle of Navarino in October 1827, in which the allied British, French, and Russian fleets almost completely destroyed the Ottoman navy, and the creation of an independent Greek kingdom 5 years later. And again, you know, it was against the Metternich's political or geopolitical intentions, this intervention, which is well-known fact. But he also paid attention to the Greek Revolution, as in other efforts, because of its legal aspect. And he regarded this intervention and pro-Greek action of three European powers as illegal, and it was for that reason a thorn in his side. The Austrian Chancellor criticized it for violating international law, as understood in Europe, even if the Ottoman Empire wasn't regarded in the legal sphere as an equal partner to European Christian countries. He saw no reason why European countries couldn't apply the same legal rules towards the Ottoman Empire as generally accepted among themselves if they wanted to maintain the very stability of the European state system as it was established at the Congress of Vienna, and if they expected the Ottoman Empire to act according to the same law in return, as, for example, a Prussian envoy in Vienna reported in connection with the Greek Revolution in June 1827. Metternich strongly opposes the principle introduced by the French government that, in the matter of the distinction between suzerainty and sovereignty, it is not necessary to define them so precisely, but the Turks would not understand the difference themselves. He thinks that if one believes one can deviate from the treaties and from the principles of law with regard to the Turks, one no longer has the right to demand of the Porte that it observes them on its part. Quotation ends. So in his opposition to the intervention in Greece, Metternich took a legal standpoint in his argumentation. It also, of course, it served his political interests. He criticized the duplicity of the Allied powers' conduct when they infringed the sovereignty of another country in a manner scarcely justifiable according to the simplest principles of respect to the independence of countries. I'm sorry, it was his quotation, I mean his verse. That, moreover, they would never have allowed to be used against themselves in a similar case. Now he commented on this issue in June 1826. What would England or Russia say to an agreement which would take place between France and Austria and which would basically establish that His British Majesty or the Russian Emperor would be deprived of an insurgent Ireland or Finland? So his standpoint was definitely conservative, but it wasn't so different in European affairs to those of other countries, but it was strictly legal. Now, I'm coming to the third point, which is the term non-intervention. It was certainly a paradox that British Foreign Minister George Canning was the principal culprit of the military intervention in Greece, although he promoted the principle of non-intervention in Latin America. And this contradiction can be easily explained by his regard for British national interests when the question of international law was of secondary importance. Canning's contribution to the non-intervention debates didn't lie in the legal sphere, but in the response of the European public when this non-intervention principle was popular. It is interesting that this term non-intervention, if we look at the documents gathered by Karin Schneider, and I would like also to express great admiration for her work here, as my colleagues did in the previous paper. So if you look at official documents, so we can see that the term was for the first time in official discussions, as far as I could learn from the documents. It was used by British diplomat Robert Gordon on the 22nd February 1821 in Ljubljana, when he explicitly referred to this principle in connection with the attitude of the British king towards European affairs. However, the debate about non-intervention reached its peak at the beginning of the 1830s, owing to the foreign policy of France after the July Revolution. And at that time, the non-intervention policy also served the French interests. It wasn't the promotion of constitutionalism, liberalism, or humanitarian aims. It simply was a geopolitical tool to create a buffer zone on the French frontier. And it comprised Spain, the Sardinian Kingdom, the German left bank of the Rhine, and Belgium. And Metternich reacted to this delimitation that there is only one interpretation for this strange conglomeration. It is the one that tells us the country is coveted by France's ambition. So we can see that what was just mentioned by Robert Gordon then became a big topic, this non-intervention principle and term, later in the 1820s and 1830s. And then Metternich also commented on this issue later from the legal point of view. And I would like to terminate my contribution. I will skip now his quotation when he claimed that this was absurd, to deny the right to an intervention to a third party or third parties. But I would like to say that finally, another outcome of this principle of law intervention was the French occupation of Ancona in February 1832, the papal town against the will of the Pope, and it was the first case of obvious aggression in Europe since the Napoleonic Wars. I mean, absolutely obvious. And I would like to terminate my contribution when I use 3 examples from the Congress of Ljubljana, that even later there were huge debates among European intellectuals in 1830s and 1840s. And I didn't use the term of Holy Alliance because I think it's a little bit misleading in the history of international law and diplomacy, I mean, practical diplomacy. But we must understand that not everybody, there was not a strict line between, for example, revolutionists or liberals and Democrats and conservatives in this debate. But because, for example, this French occupation of Ancona was later in the 1840s criticized by, for example, Italian liberals and like Massimo d'Azeglio or Vincenzo Gioberti, in the same way as it had been criticized in 1832 by Metternich and the conservatives as an act of aggression. So I would like to conclude that this debate was really complex, and we can also find some traits, some roots at the Congress of Ljubljana in its evolution. So thank you very much for your patience. And of course, I'm looking forward to a debate. Thank you.